So we have just read 2 Corinthians 1, 3 through 11. And to put that in context, we have been spending 4 weeks, just kind of like a quick little mini tour, on spiritual basics. You could call it Christianity 101. And the premise has been, listen, what if this summer, instead of taking spiritual vacation, because that's what a lot of us do, what if instead we actually worked on our spiritual rhythms? Okay, so over the last 3 weeks, we've talked about how to read better, how to pray better, how to sing better, and today I want to talk about how to share better. All right? I want to show you there's a principle, okay, and a concept, if you want to call it that, and then I want to show you the thinking behind it from this passage. Okay? Now, some of you guys know that I'm going fishing in Montana, a lot of fishing. So I thought there's another way of saying this. What I really want to do is show you the trout hole, okay, where there's a whole bunch of trout swimming in this hole. But I also want to explain to you the structure of what's going on under the surface. What are the fish doing? How's the current flowing? What are they biting on? That type of thing. Because there's places when you fish, you actually look down in the water and you're like, oh my gosh, there are fish here. But if you don't understand what's going on in that water, you won't catch a fish to save your life. And so what I want to do, there's something really, really important in this passage, and I want to show you this concept, but I want to show you how to catch the fish. Does that make sense? So here's what I'd like to do is start with the principle and concept, the trout hole. And I want you to put your finger in 2 Corinthians. Don't lose it, because we're going to come right back to it. But I want you to flip left to Acts chapter 2. Super famous passage. You've probably heard it before. Acts chapter 2. Okay, and I'm just going to read this to you. Acts chapter 2, verses 42 down through, we'll probably go through 46. We'll go through 47. Okay, so they devoted themselves, you guys heard this before? They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. This is the early Christians. A whole bunch of people have just become Christians. So right after Jesus has gone up into heaven, the Holy Spirit comes down. Peter preaches a sermon. A lot of people respond. This is what they did. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to the prayers. And awe came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles. And all who believed were together and had all things in common. Now this would be one of those places, that word common, I think you should underline it, and I'll explain why in just a second. Okay? They were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. And day by day they were attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, and they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God, finding favor with all the people, and the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. Okay, listen. Verse 44, they had all things in common. What are they doing in this passage? They're sharing. Okay? They're sharing needs. They're sharing resources. They're just sharing life. They're doing it together. Okay? The word behind common, I'm going to give you a Greek word. You don't have to remember the Greek word, but you can. Okay? The Greek word is koinos, which is closely related to another Greek word called koinonia, which means to share, to participate, to have fellowship with. That's our concept, sharing, okay? It is one of the most important things the early Christians did. And what did they experience as they did it? Not just they were taken care of, they experienced awe and a sense of God's presence, okay? When things like this happen, when you have radical sharing like this, okay, it actually feels awesome in the sense of like, whoa, God is present. God is in our midst. God is doing something. So that's the concept, sharing. That's the trout hole. Now listen, when we planted our first church back in Missoula, we had a guy who ironically was a really good fisherman, who became a Christian. He's a brand new Christian. And I remember teaching on this passage, and he came up to me and he's like, it would be amazing to be a part of a church like this that does what's happening in Acts chapter 2. Now, here's what's interesting about it. He was actually in our church. We talked about this all the time. But he didn't really participate. And what I mean by that, he would show up. He would listen. But he never gave. He never entered into anybody else's like struggle or sorrows or tribulations or struggles. And as a result, he never actually changed that much. I ran into him probably 4 or 5 years ago. Malachi and I saw him. And I was like, you know, he still identifies as a Christian, but his life is almost completely unchanged. Now, that doesn't mean that God's not done, you know, has given up on him or anything like that. But my point is, okay, is that when you figure out how to do this sharing thing, it will change your life. And if your life is not being changed in a church, it may be because you haven't figured out how to do this sharing thing. Okay? That's the principle. This guy who was a great fisherman never actually learned how to spiritually fish. Okay? All right, now let's actually look at the structure of the whole. Okay, jump back to 2 Corinthians chapter 1. I want to show you how it works and what's biting. I'm just going to read this passage for you, just a couple of verses, 3 through 7. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies, the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our affliction, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort that we ourselves are comforted by God. For as we share, do you hear that word? It's the exact same word, koinonia. As we share abundantly in Christ's sufferings, so through Christ we share, exact same word, abundantly in comfort too. If we are afflicted, it is for your comfort and salvation. If we are comforted, it is for your comfort, which you experience when you patiently endure the same sufferings that we suffer. Our hope for you is unshaken, for we know that as you share in our sufferings, you will also share in our comfort. Okay, you see the concept? It's right there. So here's what I want to do. I want to unpack the structure of the whole. If we were sitting in the river, Jay, you were there last. There's places where you sit on and it's like, and I've fished this river a lot, so I tend to know where to look. But I don't think it was actually with you. It was after you, when my director of brewing came up. There was a spot in the middle of the river where normally you don't see fish rising because it's fairly swift, right below 3 Mile, big eddy. And the way you find stuff like this is you watch where the guides fish. And we saw a guide camped out, right out in the middle, where you're like, why are they fishing out there? And it turns out there was this eddy, just a teeny tiny little eddy, like the size of this spot right here, with really, really fast water, and it was deep, it wasn't shallow. But that eddy, it was like a food conveyor belt for dead PMDs, pale morning tons. And there are trout just sitting there, and you see them like, and if you set up in the right spot, and you got to know what they're hitting from just the right spot, okay, crazy. You stand in the boat. You can't get out of the boat because it's too deep, but you're right on the edge of a bank, of like a little drop off, and the fish are, and they're monsters. Okay, so this passage right here is actually like that hole. There's something really, really significant in it, and I want to try to show you what it is. Okay, 3 things. I want to talk about the nature of affliction, the mystery of sharing, the secret to comfort. Let me say that again. The nature of affliction, the mystery of sharing, the secret to comfort. Okay, and these are just some thoughts on this, and you can ask questions. All right, let's talk about the nature of affliction. Look at verse 4. Verse 4 said, God comforts us in all our affliction so that we may be able to comfort others in what? Any affliction. Okay? I'm going to give you 3 observations. Here's the first one. Paul is saying there's a purpose to your suffering. All right? He is actually saying that God allows suffering, affliction. We're going to talk about what that means in just a second. So that you might experience comfort, not just so that you experience comfort, but so that you are actually able to offer comfort to other people in their affliction. The point is, the hard stuff that you're experiencing right now, the hard stuff that you're experiencing, Nick, the hard stuff that you're experiencing, wherever you are in your life, the hard, God actually has a purpose in it that you would experience comfort in the midst of that so that you could help other people in their hard. That's the first thing. Second thing, there's a transferability. Transferability?
Yes.
You can transfer.
Transferability. Here's what's interesting. Let's say that you experience hard. Let's say, Noah, for whatever reason, you got fired from your job. Okay, that sucked, right? Okay. Now, if you got fired from, I actually got laid off once. Terrible. Really, really hard. Okay, so you would think, like, listen, if you've experienced it, you'll be able to comfort other people who've been laid off. You'll be like, hey, I know what it's like. But Paul is actually saying something else here. He's saying you will be, what you experience in getting laid off, you will actually have something to offer comfort-wise to other people in any affliction. In other words, even if that's not their issue. How many times have you heard somebody say, you don't know what it's like to be 30 and single? And I'm like, you're right. I don't know what it's like to be 30 and single. Okay? But guess what? I actually know something about suffering, and I know something about comfort, and that actually means, according to this passage, if it's true, I'm not trying to explain how it works yet, but the point is, you in your hard actually can speak into other people in their hard, even if you haven't experienced it yourself personally, and they can be comforted in it. What that would mean if it were true, number one, you could be helpful to a lot of people. Number two, there is a purpose in your suffering. It's not pointless or aimless. Okay, now here's the third observation. This is the really big caveat. It is very easy to read affliction and suffering, that's the language that gets used in this passage, as persecution. Okay? And it certainly includes that. Okay, after all, Paul is like being persecuted by a lot of people for his faith. But here's the problem. How many of you have ever been actually persecuted for being a Christian? And my guess is not very many. We live in a place where it's pretty darn comfortable. Okay? And so what happens if you read it this way and think, oh, that only talks about like being persecuted for Jesus, for the gospel. You know what you're going to do? You're going to read it and go, this passage has nothing to do with me. In other words, whatever my suffering is just hard. You will see your hard, your suffering, your affliction will feel disconnected because you will think, oh, there's like a spiritual kind of suffering over here for the gospel. That's like missionaries. They suffer this way. And you will think that this passage doesn't have anything to do with you. I actually think it does. And I'm going to show you why. Okay? If you keep your finger in 2 Corinthians 1, but flip to the right to chapter 11, verse 24. I'm going to read a couple verses here. You may have heard this. This is the end of the book where Paul is writing, and he's actually kind of defending his men. He's got a bunch of people that actually don't think he's a good apostle. They think there's other, they call them super apostles, and they claim to be better than Paul. And Paul is kind of defending himself. And the way that he defends himself, do you know how he does it? He says, I've suffered. I've actually suffered as much as anybody. All right, now listen to what he says about suffering. 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews 40 lashes minus 1. Okay? Does that sound like suffering? Yeah. All right. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Sound like suffering? Yeah. Okay. Once I was stoned. We actually talked about not with drugs. We talked about that passage in Acts where they actually stoned him with rocks, drug him outside the city because they thought he was dead, left him for dead, and he gets back up and staggers back into the city. And the Christians are like, you really need to go to a different city because they will not make the same mistake twice. Okay, but here's the point. Does that look like suffering? Yeah, absolutely. Now, all 3 of those things are suffering for his preaching the gospel, right? This is persecution kind of suffering. But now look at what he says next. This is in, the second part of verse 25. 3 times I was shipwrecked. Does shipwreck sound like persecution? No, it's like natural disaster. You're trying to travel and there's a storm at sea, okay? A day and a night I was adrift on the sea, on frequent journeys, in danger from rivers. Danger from rivers? Does that sound like persecution? No. That's like just okay, I've got to cross the river and I'm in danger of like getting swept away. Okay? In danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from the Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers, in toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. And apart from other things, there is the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. Now listen, here, the point I'm making, when Paul talks about suffering, do you see how broad it is? It includes religious persecution, but it's way broad. He's going, listen, there are times where I can't sleep. There are times where I'm hungry. There are times where I'm cold. There are times when I'm thirsty. There are times when I'm just anxious about the churches. I just care. And he's going, all of that, I think, falls into Paul's view of suffering and affliction. So when you see suffering and affliction, I don't want you just to think like spiritual persecution. I want you to think about the hardness of life. Okay? And listen, even though we're Americans, everybody experiences this. I want to show you one more passage to reinforce what I'm saying. Flip over to the right. Go to Hebrews. It's past Timothy. Okay. Hebrews chapter 5. We talked about this passage a few weeks ago. Verses 7 through 8. In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he, what's the word? Suffered. Okay, so you see suffering? Now listen, where did Jesus suffer? Okay, yeah, listen, all right, you could be like, okay, obviously on the cross, but he actually kind of suffered in the garden before the cross, he's like praying. Okay, you could say his 3 years of ministry was suffering because look at the knucklehead disciples he had to work with, all right? He was tempted by Satan. You could say that was suffering. But I would actually, so here's what I'm saying. That is suffering. Kind of the persecution, antagonism, he's opposed by people. But I would actually make the case, and I'm going to show you in Hebrews, that I think the Bible takes a bigger view of Jesus' suffering as well. You ready for this? Flip back, it's just on the left-hand side of the page, to chapter 2, verse 14 through 18. Since, therefore, the children share in flesh and blood, do you hear the share language? Jesus likewise partook of the same things, that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is the devil, and deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. For surely it's not angels that he helps, but he helps the offspring of Abraham. Therefore, this is the key verse, he had to be made like his brothers in every respect, so that he might be a merciful and faithful high priest in the service to God to make propitiation for sins for the people. Because he himself has suffered when tempted, he is able to help those who suffer when tempted. Now, listen, do you hear what he's saying? He's saying Jesus had to share in what?
Our suffering.
Our humanity, our suffering. So when does he enter?
He's born.
As a baby. You see what I'm saying? In other words, I think you can make the case that the Bible looks at all of life, let's just call it low-grade suffering, to be human. And Jesus goes through all of it, right up from being born, all the way through his death, then he goes through hell, and then resurrection. Okay, now listen. You hear how, again, that's broad view of suffering? To suffer is to just be human. Now, if I'm right here, affliction is something that all of us experience, not just martyrs, not just religious, okay, persecution. Now, flip back to 2 Corinthians. So this is the big point. There's a purpose in your suffering. If you get something out of it, you're actually going to be able to help other people in their suffering. Okay? And this is a broad view of suffering, not just religious persecution, although it certainly includes that. And you might get some of that if you actually follow Jesus. Okay? But the point is, just because you're not getting religious persecution, no, this passage still has something to say to us. There are fish here. Okay? Second point, the mystery of sharing. All right, so the first thing is kind of the nature of suffering and affliction. Second thing is mystery of sharing. We're back in 2 Corinthians 1, verse 5. There's something mysterious here, and I just want to show it to you. As we share abundantly in Christ's sufferings, so through Christ we share abundantly in comfort too. Now, do you hear what he says about suffering here? What's he say? There's something interesting.
Now, when we suffer in this low-grade way or big-grade way, we're participating in Christ.
Well, yeah, so this is the question. He actually says, the question is, do we have to, like, what he's saying, in other words, by virtue of participating in low-grade suffering, does that automatically mean that we are experiencing Christ? He's saying what we really have to do is we have to experience Christ's suffering, and which makes it hard because we're like, man, does that mean I've got to get crucified? No, it doesn't. But the point is he qualifies the suffering. There's a way of experiencing suffering. And what he says is that if you experience that suffering, you also experience Christ's comfort. Okay. Let me say it this way. When we experience Christ's suffering abundantly, then we also experience Christ's comfort. In other words, what is true for Christ becomes true for us. Here's what he's saying. There is some kind of mystical connection going on here. Christ suffered. Now, when did Christ receive comfort? Listen, do you remember what happens in the beginning of Acts? Okay, the beginning of Hebrews. You are my son, today I have begotten you. Sit at my right hand while I make your enemies a footstool. God, after the resurrection, where is Jesus now? With the Father, seated on the throne, ruling, bringing the world under his sway. Okay? Do you think he feels comforted now? Yes.
But the comfort is because of the relationship. Right?
Okay.
Like what makes it suffering to be born as a baby is that he's actually been pulled apart from this relationship with the Trinity.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. So he leaves the Father, takes on flesh, but now here's the point. Christ suffered. Now he has comfort. And what Paul is saying is, I think, that somehow if our suffering can align with Christ's suffering, A connection is forged, and we actually experience, okay, Christ's comfort ourselves. The theological term for this is called union with Christ. Go ahead.
I think about Christ suffering, or Christ getting comforted. Like there's the ultimate comfort, union with God. But like there's also like all these little times as he lives. Like when he gets baptized, he's like, "You're my son in whom I'm well pleased." Like,
Yep.
like when you're entering into something, your father's like, "I approve."
Yeah, he doesn't just get comfort at the end. He gets ultimate comfort at the end.
Right.
But what Paul is saying, and this is what I want you to see, is he's actually saying the secret to experience, somehow, the secret, we're going to get to the comfort part, is to actually share in Christ's suffering. We're going to be like, well, what the heck does that mean? Okay, and then what I want you to see, do you see it in the passage though? If we share in his suffering, we're also going to share in his comfort. What's true of Christ? True of you. Okay? But then he says this. He says almost the exact same thing down in verse 7, but he says it of Paul and the Christians. He says, "Our hope for you is unshaken, for we know that as you share in our sufferings, you will also share in our comfort." Do you see what I'm getting at? He's saying there is some kind of mystical connection going on that when you participate in suffering in a certain way, a connection is forged, okay? And you actually experience not just the suffering, but the comfort that somebody else has already received. Okay. Now, listen, this is a really big claim. Because if it was true, that would be really, really, really significant. You would have all sorts of power to endure hardship. Okay? But there's a conundrum. Does anybody see what it is? Paul is working with a very broad definition of suffering, so broad that all humans experience it, but he's not saying that he's not saying that all humans experience comfort. In fact, Paul is arguing that not all Christians experience comfort. He's talking to Christians in Corinth that aren't experiencing the comfort. He wants them to do something different here so that they can experience the comfort. And so what we need to figure out is, well, what's that thing that, in other words, you can suffer as a human. It's not suffering for, suffering is not just a good thing. It's suffering. What is the secret that actually allows you to experience comfort in the midst of suffering? Oh, the third point. Okay. Acts chapter 2. Think about this. The experience of Christian community, they experienced awe, they experienced power, they experienced God's presence. That experience is going to be directly tied to the extent that they share in the church's mission, purpose, and plight. Okay? Suffering. This is precisely what Paul is getting at in 2 Corinthians 1. He's calling the Corinthians to engage, to share in his mission, his purpose, his plight. Now listen, think about this. If you actually do that, when you suffer, Gabe, you probably know what this is like, military. Mm-hmm. When you suffer with someone, alongside someone, for someone, or when someone suffers with you, for you, or alongside you. In other words, when you suffer together with somebody else, or they suffer together with you, it actually forms a bond. It forms a connection. Okay? It creates a bond that is deeply comforting because you know you're not alone and you're in it together. Now listen, most people and most churches don't experience this. You know why? Because most people in most churches aren't there to engage in suffering, they're there to try to escape it. It is very, very tempting to form religious communities thinking we're going to escape from the world, escape from suffering, we're going to surround ourselves with people that I like, people that look like me, we're going to make our life safe, happy, secure, while the world goes to hell. And that is not what the early church did. This is why the most important thing you can learn to do, one of the most important, you got to read, you got to pray, you got to learn to sing, but you also need to learn how to enter into the hardship that people around you are experiencing, but there's a certain way that you have to enter it in order to actually experience comfort. If you are not experiencing comfort from your faith in the midst of life's hard, maybe it's because you're failing to share it in the way that Paul was talking about. So, first question, just diagnosis. What is your attitude towards suffering, affliction, hard? Do you say, ugh, I don't like it, so I'm going to avoid it at all costs? Who are you thinking about first when you do that? Yourself. Or do you say, here's what I'm not saying. It's not like, oh, I love suffering. No, the right attitude is like, ugh, okay, it's suffering, it's hard, I don't like it, but I am willing to enter it and endure it for the sake of someone else in order to be helpful to them. That's putting them first. Okay? So what helps? I'm going to give you two things real quick. First, Jesus. If you think back to that passage in Hebrews 2:14, since the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook in the same things. In other words, what was Jesus' attitude towards suffering? He didn't embrace suffering because he thought it was good. He actually embraced suffering for the sake of the children, us, okay? But he also did it for the sake of the Father. Do you remember what he says in John chapter 4? My food is to do the will of him who sent me. The point is, Jesus is thinking about the Father, Jesus is thinking about the brothers and sisters, and he's going, I am willing to engage in this world, so he enters into our suffering for the sake of someone else. Both the people he's going to suffer alongside and the Father who sends him. Okay. When you start to enter into suffering for the sake of others, the hard, for their sake and the sake of Jesus and the Father, your posture starts to align with Paul and Jesus, and there's a connection forged. Second thing, what is the attitude? In verse 8 and 9, we were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself. Most of us think that the way I will be able to enter into suffering for other people is to get my own life free from suffering first. So I'm going to get my resources, I'm going to get my security, I'm going to find my feet, I'm going to get well and happy and healthful. And then I will maybe help other people out of my excess. And the thing is, if you do that, you'll never actually experience comfort. Because you'll never actually get to that point where you feel like you've got an abundance of resources. And the point is, Paul is saying, we were so burdened of life beyond our strength, we despaired of life itself. In other words, the secret is actually despairing of getting your own life and starting to engage even when you don't feel like you have anything to offer. You don't feel like you have strength, okay? You don't feel like you have resources, okay? Guess what? You're never going to be strong enough, never going to have excess. This was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. When I think about my friend in Missoula, never gave a dime to the church. Never really entered in and walked with anybody else in their suffering. Because he didn't think he had enough resources. And what he actually missed was the resource that you have is your need. This is what Paul's saying here. When you actually start with your need and you start looking and saying, oh my gosh, I am a needy SOB, okay? But Jesus had mercy on me. You start looking around for other people and you're like, guess what? They're needy too. But you don't look down on them because you identify with them. And you actually start to minister out of your weakness, not out of your strength. You start to minister out of reliance and dependence, not trusting in yourself. okay? And it completely changes the way you minister. So the first thing is you start caring about other people more than you care about yourself. You start caring about Jesus and what he's up to in this world more than you care about yourself. The second thing is you don't wait until you're strong enough. You actually start doing it when you're weak. And what does Paul say? When I am weak, then I am strong. You actually find strength by doing that in reliance and dependence. If we seek to engage in Christian community, holding on to your life, reserving resources for you, avoiding the hard and the suffering of others because it's too costly, your experience of Christian community is going to be shallow. But if you engage in Christian community, laying down life, entering into the lives of others, sharing in the hard, sharing what you have, sharing with, suffering with, alongside, and for others, what you're actually going to find is you start to taste something that you didn't produce. And what you're tasting is comfort from Jesus. So, okay, you will experience comfort. Others will experience comfort from you. I'm just going to, a couple of really practical things. What do you do to practice this? First of all, you look in the mirror and you repent. I'm like, God, I actually don't do this well at all. Okay? You ask Jesus to help you to start to care more about other people, enlarge your heart. You start looking for places to give, serve, help in other people's hardness. And that may just be sitting alongside them in the midst of it. Okay? You start inviting people into your life. You start asking people to help you in your life. Okay? You start looking where people need help, but you also start asking where you need help. Do you see? What you're doing is starting to share life. All of it. Okay? Start finding places to sacrifice for the sake of others. Okay? As opposed to sacrificing everything for the sake of yourself. Start looking for ways to give, to serve, to help with whatever hardness you see. Seek a mentor to help coach you on this. One of the best ways to learn how to fish, Jay, you know this is true, okay? It's to fish with somebody that knows how to fish. I actually told Marilyn, for years I've kind of wanted a tattoo secretly, but I was like, I think I may have the tattoo. I want a little brown trout. I don't know if I'm going to do this or not. Right on my wrist. And underneath it, I want the initials WWMD. What would Malachi do? Okay? In other words, that Malachi knows how to fish. And I do that. You know this, Jay. When we're on the river, there are times where I'm like, and I cuss at the trout. Okay? I think Jesus would have cussed it. Well, I don't know if Jesus would or not, but Jesus will forgive me for, if it's a problem, he will understand. But here's the point. Find somebody that knows how to fish and go fish with them a lot. Find somebody that knows how to share. Find somebody that knows how to sacrifice. Find somebody that knows how to pour themselves out and just learn from them. And start asking God to show you who in your life that you know, not just in the church, is experiencing suffering, hardship, and affliction. What does it look like to just try to pray for them, support them, encourage them? Maybe you need to coach them on some things. Okay. Anybody got anything you want to say? Questions, comments? Because we're not going to discuss during lunch.
Two quick things.
Yeah.
One, a lot of this has been going on in our prayer nights, and it's been really amazing to see.
Yeah.
Like us sharing and engaging each other's challenges and being able to believe for one another, right? And exhort one another. Right? The other thing is, I think the biggest mystery and the hardest thing about all this, this is this feels like my life first, is the relying on God who raises the dead. It's the same as abiding language, and I feel like that is the hard. You can't comfort others unless you're you don't know what that comforting feels like. You don't have anything to offer anybody. You don't have the ability to think about other people when you're struggling or not struggling without the real. And it's I feel like the most mysterious part of my faith is what does it mean to actually rely on God and abide in more than just little blips of Hail Mary prayers. You're truly rooted in there. And so
like suffering is one thing I've experienced a lot of. You know, the last 10 years I've spent a lot of time in pain, physically. And it's one thing to share with the church, to share in their suffering, to share my suffering with them. But that doesn't actually comfort unless I'm also drawing close and having an intimate relationship with Christ. So, I think if you read 1 Peter, you were talking about what does it mean to suffer as Christ suffered. If you read 1 Peter, he talks about how you will go through suffering, you've been grieved by various trials. And what Peter says is the fruit of suffering is going to be rejoicing at the revelation of Christ, right? Even in the midst of your suffering. He says, rejoice as you suffer. But the testing of your faith, when your faith is tested and found true in the midst of suffering, I think that is what he means, like suffering as Christ suffered. So when your hope is fixed on Christ in the middle of suffering, and that doesn't mean you don't ask God to take it away, right? You see this in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus begs God. He says, if there's any way to take this from me. But what gives Jesus to walk from saying, thy will be done, I will die. The only way that happens is through actually hearing the Father's voice, drawing near to the Father. So yes, we share with each other, but it has to be born out of this intimacy with Christ, with this desire to draw near to him. So suffering as Christ suffered, part of that is like, I want to honor you in my suffering, right? Like our intention as we suffer matters. Jesus says, give up your life and you'll find it. But it doesn't mean you don't pray. It doesn't mean you don't contend with God to feel better. But you have to have that intimacy with God to experience the comfort. And that actually, I think, when we're suffering, when we're pursuing comfort, it's so that we've been grown into this through it. But like, I want God to answer my prayer, not just so that I feel better, but mostly so that I can actually like share that testimony with other people, right? There's a something special that we've learned. That intimacy with Christ, that relationship with him, hearing his voice, experiencing that comfort. It's if we're just wanting it for ourselves, we're being selfish. And wanting, like actually like having something to offer and share. And that means we have to be willing to speak when we're weak. My story doesn't mean anything if people haven't heard it along the way.
What produces comfort, it's not seeking comfort. It's seeking Jesus, seeking the Father. 1 Peter, I don't know if this is the exact passage, but it's close, says, when Jesus was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but he continued entrusting himself to the one who judges justly. You see that attitude of going, I am not going to take things into my own hands. I am going to entrust myself to the Father. And Christians, this is what Paul is saying, guys, you can entrust yourselves to Jesus. Okay? He is our mediator that we go to the Father through. So, anything else? Any other questions, comments?
I actually experienced this on Saturday. Saturday I had that, side job that would really help me out. But I ate something that didn't agree with me. Friday night into like early Saturday morning, I didn't do anything except go between my bed and the toilet. And I'm like, I need this money. What am I supposed to do? But I was able to pull together. I also still needed some paint supplies. So I was able to take some Imodium, get the shit I needed, but I'm still like emotionally fucked up. And I won't, if I can blow up your spot here for a minute, Noah reaches out to me, hey man, can you pray for me? And it was just like, to the point of like, you were talking about like sharing in comfort and suffering, like, it was just like a big, like, I was like crying when I was texting you, because like, it just wasn't my words, like, and it was just like, of all the times God had asked me to comfort somebody else, like, okay, let's do it.
Let's go to the Lord's Supper. I'm going to wash my hands.